So from John chapter 1, I'm going to read the first 18 verses. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. There came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testifies concerning him. He cries out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me.' From the fullness of his grace we have all received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only who is at the Father's side, has made him known." And then just a couple verses from 1 John chapter 3. First John 3, and I'm going to read verses 7 through 10. Dear children, do not let anyone lead you astray. He who does what is right is righteous, just as God is righteous. He who does what is sinful is of the devil, because the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. No one who is born of God will continue to sin, because God's seed remains in him. He cannot go on sinning because he has been born of God. This is how we know who the children of God are and who the children of the devil are. Anyone who does not do what is right is not a child of God, nor is anyone who does not love his brother. This is the word of the Lord. When we tell a story that we all know, and that we hear again and again, and hear perhaps every season, there is always this question of pacing. How do you tell the story? How much of the story do you tell when you've got multiple times to tell it? It's a Christmas Eve service, the Sunday after Christmas, the Sunday after that, Advent beforehand. How do you tell the story, and can you tell it with any kind of suspense when we've heard it all before? And so on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, there is this tendency and perhaps this desire to get us to the manger and just stay there. And maybe stay there for a while. And so the question comes, well, what do you do the next Sunday? What do you say? Do you spoil the mood by moving too quickly past the amazing truth of the incarnation to the sober reality that lies behind it? Going from a child is born to us to the old rugged cross. If we do this too quickly, it is perhaps jarring, and it may even leave us a little resentful. Can't Jesus be a baby, at least for a day or two? Can't we have a little peace on earth, goodwill toward people? Can't we hold off Herod and that first attempt to undo this plan of salvation for just a little bit longer? Can we evade the shadow of the cross that looms in the gifts of myrrh and frankincense, expensive gifts that just happen to make really good funeral preparations, can we sleep in heavenly peace? So there is this danger that I am about to embark on, spoiling the mood of Christmas. But on the other hand, the Christmas story feels rootless if there isn't a purpose behind it. Without a reason, why are the angels singing? Why are the shepherds coming to visit? Without a reason, why do complete strangers take this baby in their arms in the temple? Without a reason, why does Herod dispatch his soldiers? If there is no reason, if there is no purpose, we have the equivalent of a Hallmark card, or perhaps even worse, a Hallmark movie. We are left with a season to believe in, and not much more. And so this morning, at the risk of spoiling the mood, we're going to talk about the purpose of this birth, acknowledging that it can put something of a damper on the simple bliss of a child is born to us. And when it comes to purpose, John's gospel is not a bad place to start. It's not that there's no glory and wonder in John's gospel, but John's gospel is really different as we read it. There is no manger, no shepherds or angels or wise men. We don't start with angelic announcements or a Roman census or a newborn baby. We start with the pre-incarnate Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. As I taught Intro to the New Testament this past semester, I tried to tell my students that we are used to this idea. We are used to Jesus being fully God and fully human. That does not strike us as strange. But John's gospel is unique in this. If we started with the Gospel of Mark, probably the first gospel that was written, our first picture of Jesus is as a 30-year-old getting baptized. We don't have any image of Jesus the child. Matthew and Luke probably come next. And Matthew and Luke have the birth of Jesus, told in somewhat different ways. Matthew's gospel emphasizing Jesus as the King of the Jews, as the true rival to Herod. Herod wants to kill him for good reason. There can be only one, and here is this other. Where Luke tells us a different story, Luke shows us the shepherds. And Luke throughout his gospel is going to say that the coming of Jesus is good news for the poor. And the shepherds are that. And so we have different visions of who Jesus is. Jesus the King, the Son of David. Not that the angels don't say that in Luke, they do. But Luke is going to say that Son of David, who was a shepherd, has come for the shepherds and those on the margins of society. And John hasn't done that. John has started at the beginning of time. Intentionally, in the beginning, just like Genesis 1. In the beginning was the Word. Because, and God said, let there be light. And that same Word that is so powerful that could create things out of nothing, that divine Word, John tells us, has become one of us. Because in verse 14, the Word became flesh. And that, you might say, is John's nativity scene. Neither shepherds nor magi, just the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. When John tells us this, he is thinking about the broad sweep of redemption history, and purposes and results start to pop up right away. The Word became flesh, and our first result is making a dwelling among us. John has some fun with the language. The Greek word for making a dwelling is pitching a tent, and it sounds like the Hebrew word for, or a Hebrew word for glory. When God dwelled among his people in the Old Testament, it was glorious. The tabernacle and then the temple were as glorious as the people could make them. The finest materials, as much gold as could be found. But the glory of the place was not so much in the fixtures on the walls. The glory was in the presence of God. So when the tabernacle was completed, God filled it with his presence, with fire and smoke so thick that Moses could not enter. And the same happens when the temple is built in Solomon's day. When the ark is brought into the temple, the place is filled with smoke so thick that the priests could not even perform their duties. Why? Because this is where God lives among his people. It is, in the logic of the Old Testament, the local street address for the King of the universe. You have a tabernacle so that God can be among his people as they travel. You have a temple once they're not traveling anymore, so that where they are home, God is at home among them. And this is so much the case that when Ezekiel has to prophesy that judgment is coming, he has to say the first thing that needs to happen is that God needs to exit the temple. We cannot have the presence of God in this place and have it be attacked by the nations. The city of God cannot fall until it is no longer the city of God. And so in Ezekiel's vision, the glory of God has to depart from the temple and remove itself to an appropriate distance, and only then can judgment come. The Gospel of John taps into this Old Testament logic and tells us that Jesus brought the glory of God near to his people in a way that had not been since the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of Solomon's temple. So we have this purpose. Jesus has come to bring the presence of God near to us. But maybe we've skipped ahead a line or two. What's the big deal with dwelling? What's the big deal with distance? Well, the distance of God is a big deal. When God is far away, his people suffer. The Psalms and prophets ask that God would draw near to his people. In the language that we talked about last Sunday, oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down. The language of lament that calls for God to come and be active in the care and concern of his people. When Isaiah 55 offers forgiveness, it is with the promise that God is near. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call on him while he is near. And the message is God has come. God is returning to his people. But there is this tension, there is this problem. A sinful people must keep some distance from a holy God. Too near, and the presence of God becomes a threat. Too near, and the holiness of God must necessarily bring judgment on unholy people. But too far away, and life disintegrates, and everything goes wrong, and we don't follow. So we have this tension. The Old Testament has this problem of needing God to be near, but not knowing how that can really be sustainable. We need God to be near. We also need some answer to human sin. We know that Jesus will bring God near, maybe even alarmingly so. Think of the fear that Peter and the other disciples sometimes display when Jesus shows that he is more than just a man. In Luke chapter 5, when Jesus calls Peter, Jesus almost sinks their boat with a great catch of fish. And Peter's reaction is, "Get away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man. God is near." Great. We're doomed. And so we need something more. Yes, the presence of God, but the presence of God needs to purify us. And so in the verses that we read from 1 John chapter 3, we get that language. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. Now, as we heard in that passage, but as is true of 1 John as a whole, the major concern of the book is holy living. The book insists on the importance of confession. It insists on walking in the light, just as God is in the light. But nowhere does John suggest that we can do it alone. Even when his language gets close, he will say in 1 John chapter 2, "I'm writing this so that you will not sin." It's like, oh, well, if it's that easy, write us a few more letters. No, John insists that we need the Son of God to appear. The reason for the incarnation, the reason for the epiphany, that is the language in 1 John 3, is to destroy the devil's work. And this is our story as well, going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. We know about the devil's work and the temptation that led our first parents astray. We know that already then, God promised a Savior, the seed of the woman who would crush the head of the serpent. We know, perhaps painfully so, that sin and temptation are very real challenges in the life of the believer. We cannot be complacent. We cannot pretend that sin isn't a real thing. It's a thing. We need the devil's work to be overcome. We need it to be destroyed. And we can't do it ourselves. And so God sent his one and only Son, Jesus Christ, to defeat this great adversary, to cancel the power of sin and death, to destroy the devil's work. The incarnation. That amazing event in Bethlehem that has the angels singing about peace on earth and God's favor being extended, has this great purpose. John's gospel is not quite done with reasons and purposes, though. John tells us that the law was given through Moses, but that grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And this ties in nicely with the theme of holiness in 1 John. The law tells you what you can and cannot do. It holds before you the standard of God's justice. Standards that become impossibly high for mere mortals like us. It is a law that convicts us, a law that is powerless to save, according to Paul, but quite strong enough to condemn. And John's gospel says that Jesus brings us something different than that. Something other than a law that condemns you, but grace and truth. This grace and truth is a phrase that has Old Testament roots, and it speaks of God's covenant faithfulness and promise keeping. For even in the Old Testament, even though people are sinners, even though God's people did not keep covenant faithfully, God was faithful. God kept promises. We know that his patience wore out. That is the story of the Old Testament. Judgment comes. But even as judgment came, the prophets could look forward to a new covenant, a permanent, gracious covenant. John 1 says that Jesus is the fulfillment of that new covenant, the good news that the law couldn't deliver. And he offers us grace and truth, a new way of living. No longer bound by the law, but receiving the grace of God and sharing the grace of God. And then there's one more purpose that John 1 holds before us, saying that no one has ever seen God. Moses in Exodus gets a glimpse of God's back, the somewhat metaphorical tail end of God's glory. The glimmers and glimpses that the Old Testament provided of God were frightening. You got too close to God, and it was frightening to other people. So Moses' face glows after he's been in the presence of God and in the tent of meeting. And it scares his fellow Israelites. And when God sends an angel or messenger to people, they almost always end up frightened for their lives. And so the most common thing that angels say is, do not be afraid. You cannot see God and live, Exodus says. No one has ever seen God, except Jesus has made him known. In the same way that Jesus is the presence of God among us, Jesus is the visible face of God for us. What does it look like when God becomes one of us? It looks like Jesus. God has become one of us, has become Emmanuel. The distance between us and God has been collapsed, and through grace rather than judgment, God has come near, and we are not doomed. Surprisingly, because sin will be paid for. The manger does lead to the cross. The devil's work will be undone. What is wrong will be made right. All of this is the reason behind the incarnation. And so the liturgy for the Lord's Supper in the back of the hymnal says it well. He came to earth to bring us to heaven. He was condemned to die that we might be pardoned. He endured the suffering and death of the cross that we might live through him. He was once forsaken by God that we might forever be accepted by him. We'll celebrate that again next Sunday. Now we know that it's kind of unfair to put the weight of the world on a newborn's shoulders. And sometimes we do this as parents, hoping that our children will fulfill the dreams that we never were able to. And if you do that wrong, it can be stifling, unfair, to have to live someone else's life instead of your own. But this is what we are saying about Jesus. He was born to live someone else's life, to die someone else's death, our death. But uniquely, as the Son of God and Son of Man. And so rather than spoiling the moment, when we reflect on Jesus' birth, we are pushed to an even greater wonder. The Son of God has come to destroy the devil's work, to bring God present among us again, to be the face of God to us, and so to bring about our salvation and bring us near to God. Amen. Let us pray.